Good morning. It's Friday, May 3rd. The war in the Middle East is now 210 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. We are still getting yanked in several directions here, folks. The war in the Middle East is no less complex than it was in October. I'd argue it's gotten harder to untangle. And then there's the influence operations on our college campuses. Those have become increasingly kinetic. As always, we'll do our best to walk and chew gum live here on the FDD Morning Brief. My plan today is to stay focused on the action in the Middle East, but then to pivot to campus for our interview with Martin Kramer. Martin's work has had a major impact on the way that I view the academy and the Middle East. He's offered some incredible insights on both, but I want to draw your attention to a book that he wrote in 2001 called Ivory Towers on Sand: The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies in America. He wrote that for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he is a visiting scholar right now. We'll talk to him about that and other campus-related topics in just a few minutes. My colleague Joe Truzman has a new piece in FDD's Long War Journal about a Shiite militia in the Kingdom of Bahrain called the Al-Ashtar Brigades, which reportedly fired a drone at Israel last week. Their attempt failed, but that's not the point. This is an Abraham Accords country now forced to deal with yet another Iran-backed terrorist group trying to light yet another fire in the Middle East. The more I learned about the incident, the more I thought of Jordan. If you'll recall, Jordan recently faced the threat of drones and missiles that Iran fired at Israel, but that traveled across Jordanian airspace. As a sovereign state that's serious about protecting its people and its territory, Jordan had no choice but to shoot them down. Similarly, Bahrain has little choice but to deal with the Al-Ashtar Brigades. A few years ago, I visited Bahrain with FDD colleagues and supporters. The Bahrainis showed us some of the weapons they confiscated from Iran-backed terror groups. I remember one official telling us, "We live in a tough neighborhood," while he let us handle homemade rockets and weapons confiscated from Iran-backed terrorist groups. Yeah, I know that sounds a lot like Israel. And so the bottom line, Iran is slowly but inexorably pushing the pragmatic countries of the region into a de facto alliance with Israel, though many wish not to declare this. But let me say the quiet part out loud, and I'll paraphrase the great son of Philadelphia, Ben Franklin. Amidst mounting threats from Iran, the good guys in the Middle East must hang together, or they most assuredly will hang separately. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. The Israelis are getting closer to shutting down Al Jazeera. The Israeli Attorney General gave a green light for this, and it comes after months of debate within the Knesset about not only the television channel, but also the country that owns it. Qatar is the financial patron of Hamas. Qatar has provided Hamas a safe haven in Doha for more than a decade. Since the war began, the Israelis have allowed Qatar to somehow broker hostage talks, but they have also exposed evidence proving that several Al Jazeera journalists were helping Hamas under the cover of their jobs. You know what I think. Al Jazeera is poison. I realize that we have information operations running all over town in Washington, and TikTok is probably the most glaring problem. But Al Jazeera needs to be registered as a foreign propaganda arm. The Department of Justice actually ordered a fairer registration for AJ Plus, Al Jazeera's US-based digital arm, back in 2020, and the Qataris have dragged their feet on registering. But after they do that, if they do that, we need to strip the Qataris of their major non-NATO ally status. Then we can name them state sponsors of terrorism, and then we can yank our aircraft off that airbase that has somehow blinded American officials to the support that Doha has provided Hamas and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS over the years. Headline 2, the Hamas-supporting government of Turkey appears to have launched a trade war against Israel. When the flotilla failed to launch last week, Erdogan apparently decided to cut off his nose to spite his face. He's no longer allowing exports to be shipped from Turkey to Haifa or Ashdod, and Turkish port authorities are now not unloading Israeli imports either. This is not chump change, folks. We're talking about $6.8 billion in trade in 2023. 3/4 of that was Turkish exports. So this is an own goal for the Turkish strongman. Of course, it's going to squeeze the Israelis too, and they're going to need to find other sources for certain imports. But if you haven't seen the response from Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz, it's worth checking out. He is pissed. And he's defiant. This comes after the Turks joined the ICJ genocide case against Israel, and in the wake of that stabbing attack against an Israeli cop by a Turkish national in Jerusalem. I wouldn't be surprised if Israelis stopped flying through the airport in Istanbul. I have refused to fly there for years. Buckle up for an economic war. And headline 3, Iran has issued more targeted sanctions against individuals here in the United States. And guess what? FDD's Supreme Leader Cliff May appeared on the list. So did Jason Brodsky, another recent guest on the FDD Morning Brief, and a bunch of others whose only crime is their opposition to the clerical regime's violent tactics and utter disregard for human rights. This comes after my colleagues Mark Dubowitz, Richard Goldberg, Ruel Marc-Garec, Matt Pottinger, and Juan Zarate all received this badge of honor from the Middle East's most wretched regime. The entire FDD organization was designated too, by the way. So what do these sanctions mean in practice? Well, let's just say Cliff and Mark don't hold stocks on the Iranian stock exchange, nor are they planning to visit Shiraz for a summer vacation. These announcements are really intended to intimidate and threaten, which of course reminds me of those campus protests. And it's worth noting that the Iranian press is celebrating those protests too. All right, speaking of protests, it's now time to bring in Martin Kramer. Martin, as I mentioned, wrote the book back in 2001 on those tenured radicals. He changed the way I looked at the professorate, and I've never looked back. He's the founding president of Shalem College in Israel, where he continues to serve on the board. He's the Walter P. Stern Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy here in D.C. And he's got some important thoughts to share with us about the campus chaos, live right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Martin Kramer.
Good morning, Jonathan.
Great to have you. So for those unfamiliar with your book, and it is, after all, more than 2 decades old, tell us about why you wrote it. I thought it was groundbreaking at the time, and I actually still refer to it from time to time. What do you think we can learn from what you wrote back then today?
Well, I wrote it as a kind of an insider. I have a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Princeton. I'm an academic. It was my field, and it was really a book about professional competence. If the experts around the year 2000 had been believed in the Middle East would be democratic, Islamism would be a force for freedom and peace, there would have been no Islamic terrorism and no 9/11. Now, of course, none of that was true. So the question I asked in that book was, how did they get it so wrong? And the answer I gave was politicization and ideological bias, which distorted analysis. And that was one key point made in the book. But there was another trend that I highlighted there. Middle Eastern studies we think of as a branch of area studies. But what was happening at around that time was that it was evolving into a field of ethnic studies. So that increasingly the practitioners in this field were appointed from those who came from the region, especially Arab and Muslim academic immigrants to the United States. So there was an ethnic transformation in the field, and instead of being a field of area studies, it became a field of Arab Islamic ethnic studies. What has happened since I published the book, the last 15 years especially, is that the politicization has yielded to radicalization. For a long time, the Middle East Studies Association, which is a professional organization of scholars in the field, had held back, hesitated to embrace the academic boycott. Even the American Studies Association jumped into that before the Middle East Studies Association did, but it's changed. Middle East Studies Association a couple of years ago did join the academic boycott of Israel. The field has become radicalized over time. Each successive generation of practitioners is more radical than the one that preceded it. So, people say that my book was prescient, but even I wasn't sufficiently pessimistic about the trajectory of Middle Eastern studies.
That never pays to be more, it never hurts to be more pessimistic. Always pays, I think, to just take as pessimistic a look as possible when it comes to this field. Well, one of the things that you did in that book is you actually named names. You talked about the tenured radicals who got it wrong and that took the field in the exact wrong direction. So my question right now is, as we watch the chaos on campus, to what extent do you see those tenured radicals involved in today's campus circus?
So the interesting thing is that the Middle East professoriate has stood back. They're there, but they're in the shadows. They want this to look like a student movement, not a faculty movement. Some of them have come out. I've seen leading professors from Columbia, from Princeton, from Georgetown in the marches or with bullhorns in their hands. but they're not on the front line. It's a bit like Hamas hiding behind civilians, actually. They hide behind the students. They have mentored these radicals, they've indoctrinated them, but they are playing a long game. And the long game is this. This has the potential to be a huge boon for Middle Eastern studies. The courses on Palestine and Israel-Palestine in the next semester will be full. It'll be just like after 9/11. I remember the same thing. And what they're going to want to do is to turn this crisis into an opportunity for themselves. And I'll give you an example. Rutgers announced that they reached a deal to disperse the encampment at Rutgers University. And what did that deal include? Rutgers agreed to establish an Arab Cultural Center at the New Brunswick campus, and also conduct a feasibility study for the creation of a Department of Middle East Studies, which tells you here that there's a real opportunity for administrations to step down and reach a compromise which doesn't require them to divest, but instead will lead them to invest. And the investment will go in the direction of Middle Eastern studies. So I think that what these professors want to do when they enter the provost's office to do these feasibility studies, to make these appointments, is to be able to say, well, we weren't on the front lines. We weren't in the encampment. You don't recognize us from that. But now let's get down to hard tacks. What do we get out of you? So, and that could happen. It's less likely to happen places where Columbia already has a Center for Palestine Studies. But in all these other second-tier institutions, which have one or two people in Middle Eastern studies, but now see the opportunity to turn that into a whole department. And I don't have to tell you what the tenor of those departments is going to be.
And of course, when we start to see these departments emerge, we can only imagine what the content of those courses will be, what the curriculum will be. Of course, it'll all be in promotion of the Palestinian cause, and probably whitewash a great deal of the history. And I can just only imagine where it goes from there.
Yeah. It's interesting, by the way, that you also do have a lot of these protests and encampments in universities where there are no Middle East professors and there are no Middle Eastern studies. We've seen that too. That tells you that there's more than one thing going on here. On those campuses, it's a toxic mix of all kinds of other fields which have tilted far left. Some of them are ethnic, or some of them are identity studies. And that have decided to jump on this bandwagon. But I think in those places too, we'll see more and more concessions made. I would look beyond the headlines of this week, the disbursement of the encampments and the deals that are, and look at the actual deals that are being cut, because they're going to define what academia looks like in the coming decade.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you specifically about Columbia. You actually have a degree from there, a master's degree, if I'm not mistaken. And some of the professors there are among the worst offenders. You've talked about them in the past. Who are they?
Well, Columbia is a very old story. It goes back a good ways. And I should say that I was there before it went off the rails. I was a graduate in 1976. Columbia is a classic case of how the dynamics work. It's a model for all the others. You had there a celebrity professor named Edward Said, the Palestinian academic and advocate, who became a celebrity professor. And as in the case of most celebrity professors, he also had his eye on Harvard. Harvard made him an offer, and Columbia had to beat the offer. So what Columbia said was, we'll give you a bigger salary, we'll give you a bigger apartment, and we'll give you something that Harvard can't give you, which is a say in the forming of our faculty, our appointments. And that's how it began. The people you see today, the most outrageous ones, Joseph Massad, of course, was mentioned in the congressional testimony. I can give you half a dozen other names. I won't do it here. Were basically appointments which were made at the impetus of Edward Said. One person gains a strong position in a university, and he brings in friends, associates, ideological allies. That's how it worked. Edward Said once wrote him, and I can quote him here. He said, this is going back almost 20 years. He wrote, "An outrageous Israeli, Martin Kramer, has described Columbia as Bir Zayt on Hudson, because there are two Palestinians teaching here. Two Palestinians in a faculty of 8,000 people. If you have two Palestinians, it makes you a terrorist hideout." Well, there were more than 2 Palestinians then there. 7 or 8 years later, they created a Center for Palestine Studies. And at that time, they boasted they had a unique concentration of experts on Palestine. And of course, now we see what we see. So you have to understand about academia that it's very much a case where the existing faculty are the ones who choose the incoming faculty. It's a very incestuous system. There is no mechanism to balance diversify the views on the faculty. So Columbia is the model, and we see it duplicated over and over again. Of course, it's the most egregious case because it's been running the longest, and because we have had a succession of administrators who haven't stood up to the professors and put their foot down and said, we have to have a wider range of opinion represented on the faculty.
But that wider opinion, I mean, you've talked about this. You've got guys like Rashid Khalidi, who's a former PLO spokesperson, who tried to hide it. By the way, you were the one, I believe, who exposed him. You've got a guy named Joseph Massad, who was, I think, arguably one of the most radical Middle Eastern professors in the United States today. Is that going to be replicated where you see this kind of radicalization within the professorate? Do you think that's the trend?
Oh, yeah, there's no question about it. And Columbia today has some pretty good competitors. I could put together a short list. Of course, Georgetown would be on that list. George Washington now would be on that list. You could go on and on. It's increasingly difficult for me today, and it happens all the time when young people come to me and say, where should I study the Middle East? I used to be able to give them 2 or 3 answers, and with confidence know that they could go there and find not just one professor, maybe one righteous professor, but if necessary, 2 or 3 who they could work with. I can't do that today. I make no recommendations today. That's
and I think, one of the things, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but there is this sort of debate about Israel studies that you see a bunch of students now that still want to study the Middle East, but they don't want to subject themselves to the kind of just craziness that you see in places like GW or Columbia. So, you've got kids that go and they study Israel, except that's not how to get into the State Department, is it?
No, it's not how to get to the State Department. And actually, it's not a solution to the problem in Middle Eastern studies. The thing that has to be remembered here is that academia is always a long game. These things don't play out over a couple of years. You can have a congressperson bringing about the firing of a professor, but another one will pop up. You have to really build an alternative. If you want an alternative to Middle Eastern studies as they exist, you have to build an alternative framework for it. Israel studies is not an alternative framework for Middle Eastern studies. Now, there is, interestingly, an alternative to MESA, the Middle East Studies Association. It's the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. That's precisely the model we need, is to say, let's build an alternative association. Those people are scattered in various different places, but we need to have 2 or 3 places where Middle Eastern studies can be taught in a different way. And that's a long game and a long-term commitment, because it'll take a generation to do that. It's not going to be settled in a congressional hearing. It's not going to be settled in a series of newspaper articles. It takes hard work.
And hard work it will be. Last question for you, Martin, before we let you go. What about these calls for a boycott against Israel, the academic boycott, as they're calling it? When was the last time we saw one of those, and what would it mean for Israeli institutions by your estimate?
Yeah, if you told me a year ago, what's the state of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I would have said it's stuck. There had no signal achievements. That could change with this protest. People like me, I and my colleagues in the humanities and certainly in Middle Eastern studies have been boycotted for years, so we're used to it, and it hasn't slowed us down, I suppose. But if you're in the sciences, in particular, it is a serious problem. Research grants, publishing, conferences, all those things are affected. I don't think that the cooperative programs with Israeli universities that some American universities have, including Columbia, are going to be terminated. That would be too great a concession. But there won't be any new ones. And the irony is that the academy in Israel is liberal left. They're precisely the ones that target. But that's also the irony of the protests here. The universities themselves are liberal left, and yet they're the ones being attacked as complicit in imperialism, colonialism, and genocide. So I think for Israeli academe, this is going to pose a long-term problem, because when you're a young academic, you need those conferences, you need those publications, and you need those letters of recommendation from abroad in order to advance. And so this is an opportunity also for courageous American academics to step forward and say, now's the time to initiate connections with our Israeli colleagues. Don't leave us isolated over in Israel. Take a step, send a letter, make a proposal, do a joint project to make sure that we don't fall off the map.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Martin Kramer, for joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD senior fellow Ord Kitry has a new piece that thrashes the factually baseless arrest warrants that the International Criminal Court is considering against leaders in Israel. Their crime, of course, is seeking to prevent another 10/7 and working to free the remaining innocent hostages still in captivity. Ord calls upon Congress and the Biden administration to leverage all available legal avenues to dissuade the ICC prosecutor from issuing these warrants. A group of bipartisan senators reportedly spoke to the ICC yesterday to that end. My colleague Andrea Stricker has produced a new FDD visual in partnership with the non-pro experts at the Institute for Science and International Security, also known as the Good ISIS. They track the number of advanced centrifuges Iran has installed over time, and it's a pretty grim picture. Since the election of Joe Biden, Iran has grown its centrifuge count by about 15x. That has significantly dropped the amount of time the theocratic regime requires to make a dash for a bomb. And finally, FDD China Program Chair Matt Pottinger has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal exposing China's support for Russia's ongoing assault on Ukraine. He explains how this tactic aligns with Beijing's broader goal of fostering global instability and undermining the West. In Matt's view, the United States must resolutely enforce sanctions and other measures to curb China's destabilizing influence, thwart a potential Russian victory in Ukraine, and prevent more chaos during an already chaotic time. That's it for today, folks. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We're lining up some all-stars. Speaking of which, for all you Star Wars fans celebrating, may the 4th be with you tomorrow. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.